Yo, welcome to JSX Jam. Today we're going to look at Lodash. If you're not familiar with Lodash, it's a utility library. It does a lot of things with arrays, objects, strings. Back when this was first introduced in 2012, it was completely necessary. JavaScript was in its infancy and it needed a lot of help. Fast forward is 2025. A lot of the things that it was really good at have modern alternatives. So in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at some of the most popular Lodash methods, and we're going to help you to decide what to keep and what to trash. All right, so let's talk about cloneDeep. This solves a huge problem in JavaScript. When people try to copy objects, they end up actually copying the references to those objects. So let's take an example here called kangaroo. Really what you have here is three nested objects. You've got the limbs object, which is nested inside of the body object, which is inside of the kangaroo object. Now, JavaScript's actually storing kangaroo as a reference to this object. This object exists, and kangaroo is now just a reference to where that object exists. If I was to say elephant equals kangaroo, I'm not creating a new object. What I'm doing is I'm copying the reference to the same object. We can see that if I were to say, oh, actually, elephants have 4 feet. I should change this. Well, what I've done is I've actually edited this object that both of these variables reference. So if I look at elephant now has 4 feet. That's what I wanted. But the problem is kangaroo also has 4 feet because they're referencing the same object. Okay, so that's a problem. We need a way to copy these objects so they don't affect each other. That's where cloneDeep came in. So let's say I was to create a dog. And instead of just copying the reference, I'm going to clone this object, which means I'm going to actually make a deep copy of everything inside that object and create a new object, and that reference is going to be stored in dog. So now, when I actually change the dog's feet to 4, kangaroo continues happily with its 2 feet, and dog has its 4 feet. Perfect. We do have some modern alternatives, one of which is called spread. This is helpful if you have a shallow object. What do I mean by shallow? Well, if you have an object that doesn't have other objects or other referential items inside of it. So let's take a look at why this is a problem. These 3 dots are essentially saying, take this object and spread it into this new object. So cat does become its own object. The problem is that the objects that live underneath, their references are being copied. So while cat may be an entirely new object, body, limbs, and feet are all still just referencing the previous objects that lived inside of kangaroo. We can see that if we were to show you cat, 4 feet, great, that's what we wanted. But again, back into kangaroo, the limbs object with the feet parameter has actually just been referenced. And so we've updated both of them when we updated the cat's feet. Okay, so what can we do about this? Well, we could spread deeply. So there's this option here where we can say links is all of the things of a kangaroo, and the body of that is all the things of a body of a kangaroo. And limbs underneath that is all the things of the limbs of the kangaroo, and we're going to override the feet on the links to before. This technically works. So links now has its 4 feet, kangaroo now has 2 feet. It's kind of ugly though. Not only is it a little bit verbose, it also requires that you know all the different levels of the object you're cloning. So if I left out a piece, it wouldn't actually get cloned in. Or if kangaroo had other objects, they would be treated as references as well. Okay, so one other option you have here is structured clone. Structured clone is something you might not be aware of, but it's available in modern browsers. So let's take a look at this. Similar to cloneDeep, if I call structured clone on kangaroo, I'm going to be able to take a look at this. I'm going to set the feet to 4. I'm going to look at the wolf, and I'll look at the kangaroo. Seems like everything's good. There's one caveat to this, and that's for certain objects like sets and functions, structured clone will not work. It won't even just copy a reference, it will just fail. So if you have an object that has those things in them, you're much better off just continuing to use cloneDeep. I'll show you an example. If I was to add to kangaroo a speak function, apparently kangaroos have a barking kind of sound when they speak. So if I was to give them a speak function, and I was to try to create a fox argument and structure clone it, I'm just going to get an error. It cannot clone a function. So if you need to clone functions and complex objects, cloneDeep's still gonna be where it's at. If I was to grab puppy here, and then I was to say puppy speak, we'd get a bark. So what's the verdict here? Do we keep it? Do we trash it? I think the short story is that for most situations, it's time to trash cloneDeep. The one caveat here is if you do have complex object with functions, sets, or classes, you're going to need to reach for cloneDeep. All right, let's take a look at get. So what problem does get solve? Let's say that we have an animal, and it's got a species and a name of that species as an object. What if we needed to get this property, this name property? Well, I can just do this, right? What if I wasn't sure about the structure of this object? What if there was some complexity to it, and maybe it's a bit dynamic? Maybe some objects have a type and some don't. I can try to grab the type, but it's going to come back as undefined. And if I were to try to uppercase that object, I'm going to get an error. So let's get rid of this so we're not throwing an error. So this is where Lodash came in. It had this argument called get. And what you could do is you could say, I've got this object. I want you to look for some sort of chained property. And if you don't find it, here's the default I want you to return. Let's get rid of this noise. If we look at this get, we're going to see that it did pull back kangaroo. And if we were to try to grab type, it's going to come back with unknown. You could also throw null in here, whatever you want to return if it doesn't exist. So this was a safe way to get different levels of an object. But we do have a modern alternative. It's really nice and very readable. So let's take a look at optional chaining. In JavaScript, we now have this ability to add a question mark after something that we're not sure exists. So in this case, I'm going to say, I want the animal object, underneath that, the species object. Now, if the species object doesn't exist, what I want you to do here is return undefined. But if it does exist, keep going. And so in this case, I can say animals.species, optionally changed, and then name. Now, if name doesn't exist, it's going to return undefined as well. And what we're going to do here is we're going to say, hey, if I'm getting null or undefined on this side, I want you to return this value. So in this case, we're actually getting kangaroo because species exists and name exists. But if I were to do this, where we know type doesn't exist, this is going to evaluate to undefined, and then it's going to give us our default value over here. Once you're aware of these syntaxes and how they work, this is very readable, and it's very easy to understand what's going on. It also means we don't have to rely on a package, and we can use modern JavaScript to get the same job done. Given all that, the verdict on this one is to trash it. We do not need get anymore. If you're using it, you can migrate away from it to use optional chaining. All right, let's talk debounce and throttle. If you're not familiar with these two methods, they can be lifesavers when it comes to performance. Typical examples here are when it comes to resizing a window or when a user scrolls. These are actions that happen fast. And so if I resize a window, I could be getting hundreds of events within seconds. If I'm scrolling, the same deal. And if I'm calling some method every single time the window resizes or scrolls, I can really hurt performance if that method takes some time to run. So let's talk about what debounce does. So let's say I do have this method that I want to call every time we resize the window. I'm going to add an event listener to the window to say, whenever you resize, call that function. And so just because I don't have a browser open here, we're going to just simulate this by running a while loop that just goes 1,000 times, pretending we're resizing. So as you can see by the output over here, it resizes 1,000 times. If you're doing something that's based on the window resizing, you do not need to know 1,000 times that the window was resized. So what if we just needed to know a couple times during that 1 second that it was resized? Well, that's where these two functions come in. Let's talk about debounce first. I'm going to get rid of these. So debounce. What's happening when we debounce something? Debounce is basically saying, I want to defer this function being called for 300 milliseconds, or whatever milliseconds you put in as this argument. If someone tries to call this function again within 300 milliseconds, we're going to stop that timer and we're going to start it again and wait 300 milliseconds. Essentially, we will not call this function unless 300 milliseconds have gone by and it's not been called. So let's take a look at this. Let's say I was to do this again, add this event listener, debounced on resize, and we'll run our fake example again. Someone's resizing the window. Well, this only gets called once. And the reason is that as this thing loops through, this gets called, it realizes that we have to wait 300 milliseconds, it gets called again before that timer's up, it resets the timer, and this thing runs all 1,000 times before it gets to that last one, 300 milliseconds goes by, and then we call resized. This is very useful for performance. We're going to talk about throttle real quick. which is similar, but slightly different. So let's say you have a resize event, but maybe someone's dragging that window around and resizing it a bunch of times, and they don't really let go of the resize toggle, and they just keep holding that. Well, if you're using debounce, your function is not going to get called until they finish resizing. This is where throttle comes in. Instead of debounce, throttle does something a little bit different. Throttle is essentially saying, I want you to make sure that this function is not called more than once in 200 milliseconds. So while debounce consistently waited, throttle is going to say, yeah, let's call it. Oh, but somebody else called it. We're going to wait. It's already been called recently. And so it's going to throttle the amount of times it can be called within a certain amount of time. You can change this to be a second. You can change it to be 60 seconds. You can change it to be 250 milliseconds. Whatever you need for your use case, we're going to say only let this be called once every X milliseconds. So going back through our example, we're going to run this counter. So even though we ran this 1,000 times, it's only running on the leading edge of it when it first happens and on the trailing edge of it. There are options to control that. So if you only wanted it to run once, no matter what, you can do that. So what's a good alternative? Really, there's nothing new in modern JavaScript. It's really going to be about rolling your own and writing your own function. The other alternatives are to use a different library like just debounce it or throttle debounce. So the verdict on this one, keep it. If you're using Lodash already, there's no point in ripping it out. These are great functions, very useful. If you don't already have Lodash, look into one of these alternatives. There's no point in bringing in Lodash if this is all you need. Let's talk about groupBy. groupBy does pretty much what it says. Let's say we have these animals and they have names and they have types, and we want to group them by these types. We want to see all the marsupials together or see all the mammals together. How do we do this? Well, Lodash has this groupBy function, and we can essentially just say, hey, I want to group by this specific key. So if I do that, awesome, they've been grouped. This is really useful, and you can do lots of things with this method. But what are the alternatives? In modern JS, we do have a map.groupBy. I wouldn't use it yet. It needs to be adopted more widely among browsers. It essentially works in a similar type of way, where you can use this map.groupBy method, pass in your object, and a function that's going to say, what do you want to group them by? This will give you the same object as a map. We also have the option to use the reduce method. A little bit more cumbersome, does give us a lot of flexibility. We can essentially say, I want to return an object where all of the keys are the types, and that gives us the same result. The verdict on this one is trash it. If you can use modern JavaScript to accomplish the same thing, you might as well. But I will say, if you're using Lodash already, and it's already in your toolkit, there's no harm in continuing to use groupBy. It's nice and readable, easy for people to understand. Might as well keep doing it. Let's talk merge. Merge solves a simple problem that can get very complex very quickly. Let's use this example. Let's say that you have an app and there's some default settings. This is what you give people when they first create their account. This is the theme, the color, how the notifications work. But let's say you do let people override those settings. And so for this user, they've set dark mode to be true instead of false, and they've actually added a type of notification called a push notification. How do we get a consolidated settings object where we use the base values from default settings, but then we override user settings? That's where Lodash's merge comes in. If I were to create this object and say, I want to see merge settings, we're going to merge default settings and user settings. The order here is very important. First of all, we provide a blank object here so that we are not overwriting default settings. Creating a new object, the first thing I want you to apply is default settings and then user settings. So whatever is further to the right is going to override whatever's further to the left. So if we take a look at this, we'll see that this new merge settings has dark mode true, which is what our user said. Still has that color, blue. Email and SMS are still there, and push is set to true. So we've successfully merged this. So what are the options when it comes to modern JavaScript? Let's take a look. We do have object assign. You're going to see a very similar syntax here. Instead of merge, I'm going to say object assign, blank object, default settings, user settings. There is a glaring problem with this though. If we take a look at this merged object, we're going to see that theme doesn't have that color blue, and notifications doesn't have the other two types. So what's happening here? Well, the problem is that this is actually a shallow merge. What's happening is that it is seeing that default settings has a theme object. So it gives this new object a theme object with dark mode false and color blue. But then what it's doing is it's saying, well, user settings also has a theme object, so I'm just gonna override the theme object entirely. This is not what we're looking for. So let's take a look at what we could do. Well, if we know that the only two objects inside are theme and notifications, we can be a little bit more verbose here and say, we're gonna object assign default settings onto this object. And then for each sub-object, we'll do another object assign over top of it to get the user settings onto it. This theoretically works. This is unideal though, because you have to do this for every level of object. And if you don't know exactly what's in the object, you can very easily overwrite certain properties. So let's talk about spreading. We could use spread, and we could say, hey, we're gonna merge this object, and we're gonna create a theme and a notification sub-object, and we're gonna spread in the default settings theme. We're going to spread in the user settings theme. We're going to spread in the default settings notification and spread in the user settings notification. This will work, but again, you have the same problem. You have to know the shape of this object, and if there are other sub-objects or things like that, you're going to end up overwriting them. So what's the verdict? The verdict here is keep it. If you're already using Lodash, you might as well use it. You get great readability, you get great safety in making sure you don't override certain parts of the object. It's very useful. If you are not using Lodash already, I'd recommend you look at a modern alternative like Deep Merge. All right, let's take a look at isEqual. Here's the problem we're going to solve. So let's say we have two objects, and we're trying to decide if these two things are the same. This comes back to our reference problem. While these have the same values, they're actually referencing different objects in the memory. So if I were to actually just say, hey, are these two equal? JavaScript's going to come back and say, nah, they're not. Even if I were to take out the strict equality and just do equals equals, it's still going to tell me they're not equal. And that's because they're pointing to different reference objects. So one thing that I could do is I could actually just stringify both these objects and compare them. And in this case, yeah, it's showing me that it's true. These two are the same, but this has issues. And the main issue here is the order of the objects. So in this example, A, B, they're both high-level objects and they're both in the same order. But if I were to actually overwrite object 2 and change it so that I wrote B first and then A, now if I try to check the equality of these two objects, it's actually going to say false, because how it's going to turn this into a string is different. So what do we do? Lodash has this isEqual method. It's going to do a deep comparison of these objects. In this case, you're going to see it's true. Even if I were to use object 2, which has different ordering, it's still coming back as true. The verdict on this one is 100% keep. isEqual is a great utility to be able to use and know that your data is the same. There is also a modern alternative if you're not already using Lodash, which is fast deep equal, which is super easy to pull into your project and use as a standalone. Let's talk pick and omit. Here's the problem it solves. Let's say you have an object with the user details. And what you want to be able to pull out the password because you don't want people seeing it. Or let's say that you just want maybe the ID and the name. You don't need everything else. Pick and omit are siblings. They do the opposite but similar thing. Let's take a look. So if I use pick from Lodash, I'm basically passing in the user object and I'm saying what I want are the keys, ID and name from this object. And what we're getting back is this object that has stripped out the other ones and just given us what we asked for. Very useful. I can do something similar but opposite. For omit, I can say, give me the user object, but don't include, in this case, password. Very useful. So what can we do in modern JavaScript? One of the options here is to rewrite these using JavaScript. They're not terribly difficult. We can basically say, hey, get me all the keys, filter them out based on which ones I've asked for. It works very similarly. Similarly, for omit, I can write a little function here. But for all of these, I could really write my own. So what are my other options? Well, we do have another option. We're going to use this syntax. What it's essentially saying is I want to apply the values of user to these variables. The first one, I want you to destructure it and pull out password. And then I'm using this REST operator to basically say, pull out everything else into this object called userSafe. So what's happening is it's saying, we're going to take password out and everything else is going to live in user. And this works beautifully. So this can be used for pick or omit. If you just want certain variables, you can destructure them and name them. And if you want everything else, you can name the ones you don't want and use the rest operator to pull the rest into a single object. The verdict here is trash it. You don't need this. It's handy, it's readable, I get it. If you're already using Lodash, go ahead and keep using it, but it is not worth pulling in Lodash just for these methods. There's ways you can do this in JavaScript that aren't overly clunky and can get the job done. All right, so we're gonna do a little bit of a lightning round. There are a bunch of things that are in Lodash that if you are still using, it's time to get rid of them. You could call this the lightning round, but you could also call this the trash it round. So let's take a look at them real quick. The map method. This is basically completely replaced with JavaScript's map method. They do the same things. They go over your array and apply a function to them. Don't use map if you're using Lodash. Exactly the same thing with filter. The Lodash version of filter is not needed. Just use the built-in array filter function. You're already there. Reduce, I'm not even going to talk about it. Same deal. Find, same deal. If we're talking about assign, you can just use the spread operator. Spread those guys in, you're good to go. Includes, modern JavaScript has an includes method on the array. Not needed, trash it. Unique, you have an array where there's multiple items that are the same. In Lodash, you could use unique to basically say, just give me the ones that are unique. But using the new set class, we can actually do the same thing in JavaScript. Beautiful. Similar things with most of the string methods, they've been replaced. It starts with and ends with. Let's say we have a phrase, I liked pickled herring. Well, I used to pull in Lodash and say starts with, pass in the phrase, but this is now built right into strings. I can take the string, starts with, and a phrase. Exact same thing with ends with, I can do the same. These are all worth trashing. If you are using any of these still when it comes to Lodash, it is time to let go and move on to a brave new world. Trash it. Lodash. This library has helped countless developers. We owe a debt of gratitude to it. It is amazing. It's not quite dead yet. It's still got some use. And if you're using it for the right things, it will help your development experience. As always, thanks for watching. Please hit the like and subscribe, and I'll see you back here for the next episode of JSX Jam.